As we are finished with our line work, we can move to the next stage of the painting, and that is underpainting. The underpainting, I am not afraid to say, is the most important part of the whole painting process. It is the base on which our colored work will stand. It helps us to clarify the values, meaning the darkest parts in the picture, or its lightest parts, and everything in between. So here we see the light goes from the viewer perspective, which makes sense because it's photograph, and the dominant white is in the feather. So distribution of whites and darks and all the tones in between is extremely important when working on any painting. The balance needs to be right. It helps us to determine focus, and it saves us the work later. So let's look a little bit closer on what mistakes in values might look like, so you can see more on proper examples what we want to avoid. Here is in this photo you can see one mistake in values, and that means no dark point, no blacks. You have overuse of middle tones, which makes picture look flat and boring. The opposite mistake of values is illustrated here. Here is overuse of blacks and underuse of middle tones. We want them just right. We do not want to lose all the information just to have it covered in black. That would not help us later when we will be colorizing the photos. So to help us determine which values are where, which darks and which lights are within the picture, I have created this map. You can print it out and keep it at hand while painting, because it is very, very useful to know what lightness these certain areas are supposed to have. And as we will be painting, we will start from general to detail. Meaning, especially in the beginning, this map will be extremely helpful for us. So here as we start, you can see I have already done a bit of hair and the hairband, and we can continue. I'm using acrylic paints simply because they dry much quicker than oils, and I'm using here sienna, black and white, only those three. So you can see my messy palette, and let's go. So keeping in mind our map, which I have prepared before, let's just try to get the general idea without any details yet, where the darks will be and what level of darkness. Here you can see I am doing a trick. If you are having a wet paint, acrylic paint works with oil paint as well, and you add a little bit of water on it, eventually oil if you use oils, and then wipe it off, you create a light spot. So you can wipe the color with the thinner. Now the feather, you can see I am moving quite quickly, trying to get first the overall gray map simulated, the one which I have printed out for you. No details at the beginning, just considering on very general lights and darks, so to make sure that the lightest and darkest points are already signalized where they are going to be, and for the beginning that will be enough. One of the darkest spots is the area around earring, as we already pointed out, but then also the tie. So you can see I am mirroring this now. The necktie and the feather under the chin are also our focus points with the darkest darks from the whole picture. make sure to thin the color a lot. You can see I am using a lot of water. I am using almost the paint almost like an aquarelle. That's because it is one of the first layers, and we will paint over that later once it dries up a bit. So now we have laid in the basics. I have painted the whole face with a light gray to have something to start. It's always a good idea to start with middle tones, because you can always go either lighter or darker depending what is needed in that very moment. Do not worry too much about an eye. The most important is that it is on the right spot. The details are not as important yet. The same applies to the other facial features, like a cheekbone, the lips. We just need to keep the proportions, but not the overall details. Those will come later. You can see I am using a lot the technique of wiping off the color. That's because the paint is very wet still, and I can do it as long as I do it quickly, because acrylics, as you probably know, dry very, very quick. And as you can see, just with this minimalistic technique of putting extremely watered down color on its place and then wiping it off, we can model pretty well basics of the man's face, basic features. Now I've swapped for the smaller brush, and I'm going for very first details, because the overall structure of his skull and of his hair we already have in place. So now we can slowly start with the details, and then we will see where we will move from there. The eye is a bit confusing, because as we have discovered during our lights and darks analysis earlier, the light is going from the direction of the observer, because this was a photographical portrait, so it is very likely that there was a light source pointing at this man. Therefore, the lightest part of his face is his cheekbone and side of his nose. Technically, that would mean that this light also makes his eye look lighter, but that's not the case. Probably there was a paint used around his eye, most likely, and it also seems like his skull structure is favoring a bit of a shadow in that area. His eyes seem to be laying a bit deeper in his skull, so we are having a quite strong contrast of this strong shadow slash also face paint around an eye, and at the same time the reflecting light on his cheekbone and nose just around the eye area. And that also helps very much with the overall effect. It makes it more dramatic and definitely more interesting, and it gives his face more expression. So now you can see me slowly working my way down across the cheekbone to the mouth. Very, very important point for you while you are painting: do not start with a face paint. Leave the face paint which goes from his eye across his cheek until his ear. Leave it until the end, because first we want to kind of model the shape of his face and make sure that it is very, very clear, and then it will be much easier to paint the face paint over it, because it will be clear that the cheekbone is not flat. It will already be having its shadows and lines on place. It will be more intuitive to put the face paint over that. So I will say it again: do not start with face paint. I know it is tempting, because it is one of the most striking points when you look at the man's face, but leave it at the end. Now, when we look at his lips, one thing which struck me as well is that they are darker So, question is if this is San Diego's natural color, or if he's using again any type of a face paint. This cannot be excluded as well. It could be that they were also highlighted for the photography, since it is black and white photography and makeup was quite common to make them look better. Stronger makeup is needed with the black and white. You have probably noticed there is a drop of black paint running down from his necktie until almost the end of the canvas. I have left this one there purposefully, just because I like the effect it gives. And let's see how it looks at the end. We can still get rid of it later, because we can cover it with white paint, so it won't be visible, but for now, I like the effect it gives us. The name San Diego itself is puzzling. It is unlikely to be his real name, as it doesn't align with the naming conventions of plain stripes. Instead, it may have been assigned for the fair, chosen to sound exotic or to appeal to the audience's expectations. This was a common practice at such events, where organizers often altered participants' names and backstories to make them more marketable. In 1904, the plain stripes were living in a period of profound transition and hardship. By the early 20th century, the autonomy and way of life of Native American plain stripes, such as Lakota, Cheyenne, Blackfoot, Arapaho, and others, had been severely disrupted by US government policies and settler expansion. Plain stripes had been forcibly removed from their ancestral lands through treaties that were often signed under duress or outright broken by the US government. By 1904, most tribes had been confined to reservations, often on lands that were far less fertile and lacked the resources they depended on for their traditional way of life, such as buffalo. The buffalo, central to the economic, culture, and spiritual life of the plain stripes, had been nearly exterminated by the late 19th century. This destruction was a deliberate strategy by the US government to weaken the tribes and force them onto reservations. US assimilation policies aimed to eradicate indigenous cultures. Native children were sent to boarding schools, where they were forced to adopt Western customs, speak English, and abandon their traditions. Practices like traditional ceremonies, wearing regalia, and speaking native languages were often banned. Now back to our painting. We have moved now towards pretty well modeled profile, even though some values are still of need of adjustment, mostly the chin and the cheekbone and nose, because they definitely shouldn't be the same level of lightness. The cheekbone and nose should be lighter, but we will fix this later, or I will. Maybe you already have this laid down in your underpainting. You can also see I have added the sienna, especially on the forehead, to make it then easier to colorize. And I am just mixing the sienna to already prepared mix of gray, so the value does not change. You have probably also noticed we are using much less watered down color. Our color is now saturated and covers very well. So as said, life on reservations was marked by poverty and dependency. Many tribes were unable to sustain themselves on governmental ratios, which were often insufficient or mismanaged. Tribal economies that once revolved around hunting and trade were dismantled. The Louisiana Purchase Exposition World's Fair in St. Louis showcased Native Americans as part of an ethnographic exhibit, portraying them in ways that perpetuated stereotypes and romanticized their vanishing culture. Individuals from Plains tribes were often photographed and displayed in traditional attire, which they were however often forbidden to wear in real life and to practice what the attire was for. This was usually staged for the audience and did not reflect their daily struggles they were facing. Despite these challenges, many Plains tribes resisted assimilation and maintained their cultural practices in secret. Leaders like Sitting Bull, prior to his death in 1890, and others had inspired movements to resistance, which continued through religious and cultural preservation. The Ghost Dance movement, which sought to restore native lands and traditions, had been brutally suppressed in the Wounded Knee Massacre of 1890, but continued to hold spiritual significance. Plains tribes were caught between two worlds, a declining traditional way of life and the oppressive policies of assimilation. However, the cultural resilience of native people persisted. Many individuals, such as those photographed at the time, wore traditional regalia not just for public displays, but also as an act of cultural preservation and pride. These suppressions make San Diego's attire particularly poignant. The combination of traditional and Western clothing reflects a complex reality. It was both a concession to the fair's expectations and a subtle act of resistance, asserting his cultural identity in the face of erasure.